Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge.
Hello and welcome to India Colonized, a weekly podcast where we explore South Asia's colonial past and its continuing legacy in the contemporary world. Today, on our podcast, we have with us an award-winning author, Mr. Sudeep Chakravarti, to talk about his book Plassey, The Battle That Changed the Course of Indian History. Plassey by Sudeep Chakravarti is an absolutely engaging and entertaining book, written with details of intrigues, vanity, and unriddling the playing of economics and politics of the time. He has wonderfully delineated the cast of characters from the prejudice and perceived conceptions, and has dusted the layered narrative settled over the centuries that have passed since the incident. Sudeep Chakravarti is an award-winning author of best-selling works of narrative non-fiction, including Plassey, The Battle That Changed the Course of Indian History, The Bengalis, A Portrait of Community, and an extensively published columnist. He has over 3 decades of experience in media. Sudeep has worked with major global and Indian media organizations, including the Asian Wall Street Journal, where he began his career, and has held leadership positions at Sunday, the India Today Group, NHT Media. Here is my conversation with Mr. Sudeep Chakravarti on his book, Plassey. Hey, Mr. Chakravarti, we are glad to have you on our podcast, India Colonized. So before we get down to discussing your absolutely entertaining book, we would love to discuss and hear about yourself, not just your career, but also a bit about your intellectual journey, who are the sort of thinkers who influenced you, the books that have influenced you throughout this journey.
Well, I'm not sure about my intellectual journey. I wouldn't aspire to such a refined description, but a journey for sure. Thank you for asking that question. It is. I've always been interested in history for as long as I can recall. Even as a child, I would be instinctively drawn towards aspects of history, Indian history, Asian history, world history, and I have the advantage because even though growing up, I primarily read in Bengali, which is my mother tongue. English is a very close. I would call it a mother tongue in some ways as well. But even Bengali, there were many books of history available, or instances of history available to me, and my parents made sure that they gifted me books primarily. So I grew up with, and I requested books that were related to history or historical people, or people in history, events in history, and I was very curious. So it's as it goes back a long way, and whether it's medieval Indian history, ancient Indian history, modern Indian history, whether it's the Vietnam War or the World Wars, European history, the Renaissance, Japanese, Chinese, Russian history, you name it, I just was always very curious. So and that sort of translated very quickly into my studies at school. I was fortunate to have several teachers who were excellent teachers of history. So they would make history come alive for us. So if you were discussing the Battle of Haldighati, then that teacher would, Vijay Mathu, for instance, one of the teachers at Mayo College in Ajmer, would make history come alive for us in class. And I had to credit not just my own interest or my parents, but also my teachers of history, people who taught me history when I was growing up, for my abiding interest and my continuing interest and my increasing love for history. So, all credit to my teachers. And he's just one example that I'm giving you. There are others. I read history at university. I was at St. Stephen's College. I read history there. I had excellent lecturers and professors. And I have no hesitation mentioning some people who really made things good for me there. There's Professor Upinder Singh, who taught me ancient Indian history. There is Sumit Guha, who taught me modern European history. There was Tanika Sarkar, who taught us Far Eastern history. There's P.S. Dwivedi, who taught us ancient Indian history in a beautifully colorful way. There was Mohammed Amin Saab, who was a absolutely delightful raconteur for medieval Indian history. There was Dave Baker, who taught us European history. These are institutions in their own way now, and I'm just so fortunate that along with my generation of people who were at university, and there were, of course, excellent professors and lecturers across India as well, but I can only speak of what I experienced. So I must confess that even though some of my grades may not have reflected uh, my teachers' interest in we uh, how we were taught and how much attention we paid, but I absolutely I mean, no problem in admitting that what I learned at school and college and what I learned from my teachers helped in a great way to take me ahead. After my studies in history, I became a journalist, a business journalist, and then a political and a foreign affairs journalist, all kinds of things, an editor. But I was always very, very keen on history. And I was always drawn to any article that I've written, any article that I've edited. For me, the background, the root of it, the root cause of events and people, why people behave in a particular way, have always for me been rooted in history. There is no getting away from history, whatever I do. Uh, Subsequent to my career in journalism, when I took actively to writing books, I've written novels, I've written narrative nonfiction, which has been about it's set in northeastern India. It's set in the Maoist areas of Maoist rebellion in business and human rights. In anthropology, I've written a biography of the Bengali people. And the reason why we are meeting now over history of Plassey, among other things, they're all very, very rooted in history. Even my fiction is deep. I mean, I research a lot for my fiction, and I have to get the context right, even if some of the protagonists are make believe or situations are make believe. They're very clearly and deeply set in a historical context, whether it's the emergency or whether it's the anti-Sikh riots or whether it's the Babri Masjid time of the Babri Masjid movement and the demolition of the Babri Masjid and the effect thereafter on India. These are all very, very rooted in history. I mean, whatever I do is rooted in history. And in fact, I'm engaged in course in history or politics which is rooted in history. And I'm actually editing as we speak a series in modern Indian history for a poll called livehistoryindia.com, which is for the past 3 years, 3.5 years, has been making a lot of waves, and I'm very glad to be editing the Making of Modern India series for them for the next. It will run right up till August 15, 2022, the 75th anniversary of India's independence. And so everything I do, Omer, is that somehow or the other it ends up being very rooted in history, and I absolutely love it. What can I say?
Wow. So what drove you to history and drove you to write the book on Plassey? Like, what are the questions that you set out to answer during this project?
Well, I've always been struck by how much of Indian history is written with a political purpose, or has been written with a political purpose. It began during the time. I mean, in history always, even in the ancient and medieval times, where history has been written, it's usually been a hagiographic history. I mean, then you didn't have history. You had essentially storytellers, courtiers attached to a particular king or emperor who would write glories about their king or emperor, and and there were other histories from travelers from say China or elsewhere or Italy or whatever. But they were always those in some ways are more honest histories to my mind. But and then thereafter, when say the medieval India went into late medieval India and it went into sort of the colonial India, the British colonial period specifically, the history began to be written from the British perspective. And they valorized the British, and everything was very Livingstonian, and everything was from deepest, darkest India, like it was deepest, darkest Africa. So how do you do, Mr. Livingston, and how do all these natives, and so on and so forth. So it's always been that sort of history writing. Equally, when subcontinental nationalism began to grow, or Indian nationalism began to grow, people began to question these histories to their credit. For instance, Dadabhai Naoroji was one of the first people, in fact, the person to talk about the drain of wealth about 100 years before, or more, 150 years before, say, Shashi Tharoor made drain of wealth famous, that is Oxford debate. It was Dadabhai Naoroji who actually brought the data to the Indian people, and as an MP, elected MP in the British Parliament, the first colored person to do so, he threw facts at the British politicians, and he basically rewrote the narrative of history, and he birthed nationalism. But having said that, there was also other streams of nationalism. Then there was a need to write history from the Indian nationalist perspective. Then very quickly from the Hindu nationalist perspective. Equally quickly from the Islamic nationalist perspective. And that time there was no Pakistan, the idea of Pakistan I'm talking about. But there was a need to tell the story of the Muslim people of India, which began with in 1906, because there was a Mohammedan Education Society, for instance. They were very good with the idea of emancipating and empowering the Muslims of India, and part of that it was not just the tilaks of India who were writing histories. There were also the people from other communities, if you will, religious and ethnic and caste communities who were writing or rewriting their own histories. But there are problems with these kind of things because sometimes people get overzealous in trying to write history. They tend to overcorrect sometimes, and that leads to problems. And that is a problem that we're facing very acutely in present day India, for instance, where history is being rewritten even as it happens. There is a dangerous writing and rewriting of history. There is a whitewashing of history. There's a saffron washing of history. There is a whatever you want to call it, washing of history. And this is very, very dangerous. All the more reason why people who have the time, the inclination, the resources, the ability, the interest primarily, and the opportunity to write history in the manner history is ideally supposed to be written, which is basically you look at as many available sources. You don't put blinkers on. You keep an open mind. You keep an open heart. You keep your eyes open. You keep your ears open. For me, history is living history. So you look around you. You research as much as you can. Then you put it all together. Look at aspects that need readdressing, that need rewriting, that need to be looked at, and then you present to your public, your readership, your viewership, your audience. And Plassey is one such instance, which I thought that was very, it was not addressed enough, primarily as an event of its own importance. Number one. Number two, a lot of the histories of Plassey have been written by British historians who continue to valorize Robert Clive, who continue to valorize the British effort, and who continue to approach Plassey from the perspective of this grand British enterprise when there were many other layers. For instance, Robert Clive was this close to losing Plassey, and how many British people will acknowledge that? For instance, okay, he won it, but the point is that history is not. Then there is no joy of history. The history is also about the dynamics. It's also about the various layers of history. So how many people acknowledge that? How many people are willing to acknowledge that, from the Indian nationalist perspective, that or the Hindu nationalist perspective, that there is a writing of the addressing of Plassey as, oh, okay, the big bad Yavanas, the Muslim, were finally got rid of by the British. Glory be. But how many are willing to acknowledge that it was a geopolitical and geo-economic enterprise, that it was not necessarily a religious enterprise. It was not at all an enterprise of religion. It was an enterprise of convenience, of people's, of the British, of the Sirajala, of the British East India Company, the French East India Company, the Zamindars of Bengal, the Mughal Empire, the disappearing, the fast disappearing Mughal Empire, the fast cracking Mughal Empire, whatever you want, however you want to describe it, or the leaders of Murshidabad, the nobility who wanted their interest to be safeguarded, they went against the then Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla. These are all for interests and expediency, or a power, or to protect their interests, to protect their true privileges, to protect their business interests, political interests, self-interest. There was no nationalistic enterprise in that thing, really. In fact, then Siraj-ud-Dawla, for instance, sometimes in Bangladesh in particular, is portrayed as last Bengali Nawab. I mean, he wasn't Bengali, for heaven's sake. He was just a last free Nawab of Bengal. So history, there is always a need to position events in history or people in history with an interest in mind. And all the more reason for those who can end history without an agenda, except for presenting history in the manner that history should be presented. The perspectives, all the lacunae, all the sources, all the layers, all the sub-layers, the backstories, the personalities, stories, the developments, so on and so forth. And I mean, I'm sure we'll share this in the course of this conversation, but let me end this reply here by saying history is how you present it. And it is the job, the duty of a historian and a storyteller, or a narrator, or a sutradhar, the mantle chosen to wear in my time now, that it is incumbent on us, it's our absolutely sacred duty to question, interrogate sort of these hoary ideas of history, the notions of history, and present history in the uncluttered, informative manner, the layered manner that it ought to be presented.
As someone who's extensively worked on the Battle of Plassey, how would you briefly explain it to someone who has never heard of the battle? I mean, how significant and vital is this battle in Indian history, and especially for the colonial history of the subcontinent, and why?
Well, it's quite simple, actually, if you were to pay attention to it. And when I'm saying you, I mean we, us, all of us. It is extremely significant in subcontinental history and Indian history, Pakistani history, Bangladeshi history, Nepali history, the history of the subcontinent, history of Asia, and therefore the history of the world in many ways. For instance, I'm very fond of saying this, is that we could be having this conversation in French. The French were very, very powerful players in India and the Indian subcontinent at that particular point of time, and they were big players in Asia at that point of time, and they were also very, very significant players in Europe as a direct competitor to England, to Great Britain, and in the Americas, in Africa, in the Caribbean. So, there was a sort of a global dynamics that's happening, and the people don't realize it, how significant a role the French played in the politics of 18th century Bengal, in the politics of 18th century India. It was a very close run. We could be speaking in Marathi, because at that point of time, when in the time of the fading Mughal, the single most potent subcontinental force was the Maratha Confederacy, and they were rampant across northern India. They were all across western India. They had absolute control of central India. They'd gone to the south. They'd moved east to the extent that Siraj-ud-Dawla was in the Nawab of Bengal when the Battle of Plassey took place on 23rd of June 1757. when his grandfather, who he succeeded, Nawab the Aliwad Khan, was spent 10 years of his reign battling the raids into Bengal to the extent that he had to sue for peace in 1751 and cede not just the chauth or the tax that the Marathas were trying to pressure Bengal Suba of the Mughal Empire into paying, but also cede the territory of Orissa to the Marathas Confederacy. So you have Aliwal Khan, who was called the Nawab of, the Suba of Bengal or the Nawab of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, but he was actually the Nawab of Bengal and Bihar. For all practical purposes after 1751. So the Marathas were a very, very strong force. And Robert actually reached out to the Marathas to ally with the Marathas against Siraj-ud-Dawla. So I'm just giving you some ideas as to how significant that battle is. That the English came through, the British East Indies Company came through, and won the battle in alliance with several political people in opposition to Siraj-ud-Dawla in the court of Bengal in Murshidabad at that particular point of time. The names that you hear of are his key generals, Mir Jafar, who became Nawab after Siraj-ud-Dawla was deposed. You have names shown about like the bankers, the Jagat Seth at that particular point of time, the bankers to the world, the big title, who are said to have bankrolled the British into the Battle of Plassey, but all they did was essentially tell the British and the British East India Company that they were protecting their businesses. They calculated the decision that Siraj was not as secure for their businesses as somebody else might be. So they propped up Mir Jafar as a candidate along with the British East India Company. So this was all, so the battle was fought because what happened is that Bengal at that particular point in time and for many centuries prior and for many years subsequent to that was the single richest province in the Indian Empire, not just of the British but also of the Mughal. And so it was a plum posting. It was really the plum, the jewel of not just the British Empire, it was also the jewel of the Mughal Empire at its zenith as well as when it was fading. So it was a very, very coveted province. Bengal was an important province for trade to European entities who came in. Bengal, unlike any other part of India, was connected, and Bengal I'm talking about is not just the West Bengal state of West Bengal in India that you have, but it included present-day Bangladesh as well. It included present-day Bihar as well. It included present-day Orissa as well. That was a Suba of Bengal. It included parts of Assam, present-day Assam as well. That's how the Suba of Bengal went. And it was this huge deltaic place, deeply connected with rivers. Commerce was extremely easy to conduct. You could come in from the Bay of Bengal, come up river and through the Sundarbans and get to present-day Calcutta, go upriver to all the Indian settlements that the British had, the French had, the Dutch had, the Danes had, the Portuguese had, and trade would be seamless. And you could go upriver. There was no Farakka barrage those days. So you could go upriver and you could go up to Patna, to Munger, to Varanasi, to Saharanpur, wherever you wanted. And you connect with the Yamuna and go up to Delhi. I mean, imagine the networking that Bengal provided you with its granary, with its jute, with its saltpeter, which was very, very important product of Bengal, which is important not just for preservation of foodstuff, but also very, very important an ingredient for the manufacture of gunpowder. Which is an extremely important factor. Bengal fabrics were world famous, which is one of the reasons that drew people to Bengal in the first and to Murshidabad, among other places, to Dhaka. So it was a huge hub of Asian trade. It became a huge hub of Asian trade as well. So it was an important thing to fight over, and it essentially grew out of a trade dispute between the British East India Company and the Nawabs of Bengal, And it wasn't just Siraj-ud-Dowlah who ran into disputes with, or the other way around, with the British East India Company. The British East India Company had been even fought with them. I mean, they've been fighting and skirmishing with the Mughal Empire way before they even set foot in Bengal, because that's how the British did business. I mean, they threatened Jahangir, the Emperor Jahangir, with naval blockades, the Arabian Sea. They would interdict royal Mughal shipping in order to leverage pressure at court in order to gain trading concessions. This is how the British did business. There's nothing new about it. It's just that Siraj-ud-Dowlah and Bengal and the British and their competition, the competitors, the French, and at the point you had the competition for the riches of Bengal, or the economy of Bengal, the trading potential of Bengal, and therefore the political control of Bengal. You see, it's all interconnected, Omar. It's not any one thing. We have to understand just how interconnected things are in history. That's when you get to the root cause of history. Then you have a situation where you have the British and the French fighting wars in Europe, the effect of which carried over into Switzerland. So they were fighting in southern India in the 1740s, in the Carnatic, what is called the Carnatic. They were fighting for Fort St. George in Chennai, in present-day Chennai, Pondicherry, and they were playing politics. And the same politics that they brought up to Bengal 10, 15 years later. The British and French were playing each other off by using, they were offering each other services with the local rulers of the South. So it was all a multiplicity of things that came together, and that also came in with the feeling in the Bengal court when this 23-year-old boy Siraj-ud-Dowlah takes over as the Nawab of Bengal, in April in 1786. Look at it. People are postgraduate students when they're 22, 23. And this boy is the Nawab of Bengal. And he immediately thrown into this geopolitical and geo-economic, which is also the lair in Murshidabad, which we don't pay attention to. That his aunt, a lady called Playssey, is Ali Wazir Khan's, one of Ali Khan's daughters, and Siraj's mother, Amina Begum's older sister, Ghassiri, who wanted her son, who's actually a biological brother, Raj, from Ikram-ud-Dowlah, who Amina Begum and Siraj's father given in as an adoption to their sister and her husband, wanted Ikram to become Nawab. Ikram died at a young age, and Ghassiri Begum never liked Siraj, and was dead set against Siraj, and to the extent that she fought before the British were even in the picture, before Robert Clive came to Calcutta with the British East India Company to try and get rid of Siraj by using other people who were available to her, like Siraj's cousin Shaukat Jung, who was in Purnia in Bihar at that time. In fact, before the Battle of Plassey, you had Shaukat Jung moving towards Murshidabad from Purnia to effect the coup of Siraj-ud-Dowlah and then backing off when Siraj got wind of it and fought and pushed back. Shaukat Jung backed off. And then you had Mir Jafar, who was the Mir Baksh of the Bengal army and one of the old forces of the Bengal fort at that point in time, who didn't get along with Siraj because Siraj stripped him off his post when he became Nawab. So you had a lot of these jealousies and these resentments in Bengal fort as well. And when the British East India Company came together to secure their economic and political position in Bengal, and also to offset, to keep away the French influence in Bengal, the Dutch influence in Bengal, right, and the Mughal influence in Bengal, and the Maratha influence in Bengal, it was just expedient for them to reach out and find allies. To be sure, the French were looking for similar allies to secure their interests. The British basically just cut a better deal. for themselves. And they managed to win the Battle of Plassey. That's how important the battle is. And it's after the Battle of Plassey in 23rd of June, on 23rd of June 1757, that you have in short order, that you have the British taking over effectively the administrative, the political control of Bengal immediately, the richest province still, fading Mughal Empire, still technically the Mughal Empire. Even then, the Mughal Empire continued until 1857, technically. So they took over effectively the political and administrative control, and therefore the economic control of the richest province in the subcontinent because they controlled the next few Nawabs, Mir Jafar, Mir Qasim, Mir Jafar's son-in-law, and then back to Mir Jafar. They were just appointing Nawabs for a fee and getting concessions, trading concessions to trade freely in Bengal, invoking what they'd received from the Mughal Empire, Empire Farooq Siyar in 1717, to trade duty-free in Bengal, which was misused, which also upset Sirajuddaula, which also was one of the reasons what led to the tension between the company and the Nawab. So there are many reasons. We have to keep all these things in mind. And then it's only because they were enabled with political and economic power in Bengal that they were able to get the resources, the money, enrich the company and themselves to actually take on the forces of Mir Qasim and the Mughal Emperor at that time and take them on in 1764 in the Battle of Buxar and defeat these forces. And after that, again, through the Treaty of Allahabad, the Diwani of the province of Subron. So imagine the chain of the events that the Battle of Plassey set upon, that you have this company, this corporate enterprise, with offices in London on Leadenhall Street, run in India, operated in India by a bunch of absolutely clever, but also foolhardy to a great extent, very high risk-taking individuals, and basically effect a corporate coup in a province of Bengal, in the empire of Bengal, and then take over that province between 1757 and 1764. 11 years, they have the province, and then by the early 19th century, they kicked the Marathas out of Delhi, taken over control of the Mughal Empire, and by 1857, they had India. I mean, just look at what this one battle, which the British were this close to losing, and Robert Clive, who led the forces against the Nawab of Bengal, Sirajuddaula, till 2 days before, till the day before the battle, till the night before the battle, till the morning of the battle, Robert Clive, the Lion of Bengal, Clive of India, and heaven-sent general, as it is described in British Parliament, was an absolute nervous wreck and showed up as the opium addict he was, who took opium to calm his nerves because he was a nervous wreck. That's also the story of the Battle of Plassey.
Well, what truly captivated me is the gripping narrative and the colors in which you have beautifully and colorfully painted the cast of characters involved in the war, especially of Clive and Sirajuddaula. So, tell us a bit about these figures and how the perception of these individuals has changed over ages, or rather, how it has become to suffer a kind of monotonous narrative.
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, because you have to look, when you look at a person, you have to look at, when you look at a particular character, you have to also look at impulses that drove the character. And who are the people who wrote the histories, which became dominant narratives about these characters, right? The minute you go beyond them, you open a treasure chest, a treasure trove of information, which people simply haven't, many people, haven't simply bothered to look at. And for instance, the narrative about Sirajuddaula in this sort of absolute lumpen element who ran around molesting and raping women in Murshidabad and would drown people, drown boatloads of people for entertainment, has never been questioned. But there is no one source that talks about this, and a best source, and that has become the law. Now, Ali Berdi Khan, even in his worst moments, said you have to look after your subjects. Now, would he, when Siraj was growing up, even the Siraj was his like pet, the love of his life, would he risk his kingdom, his survival, and the loyalty by letting this absolutely like thug run riot across Murshidabad, literally run riot across Murshidabad with no control? I'm not saying it was all black and white, because nobody questioning this. Nobody. There is a myth about Siraj that he was a fool and that he always fought with the British. When you look at the fact is that he may be impulsive, but he was no fool. We forget that in 1756, he actually kicked the British out of Calcutta because of a dispute. Siraj's army came and kicked the British out of Calcutta. In fact, the British East India Company were very at that particular point in time. And it was only as a reaction to that Robert Clive and Admiral Charles Watson came from Madras not to take back Calcutta necessarily, but to negotiate with Siraj in order to regain the concessions they lost, to make peace with Siraj. That was the charter they had. And the other charter was to get rid of the French from Bengal. That was the plan that they came to Calcutta with. So let's get real here. You look at I'm not looking at mythical history. I'm looking at, for instance, I look at documents. So when I'm making these statements, I'm looking at East India Company documents, which tell me that the East India Company, British East India Company Council at Calcutta at that point in time, when Siraj was made Crown Prince, if you will, the heir apparent of Ali Berdi Khan in 1753-54, he came down to Hooghly, which is, there is a Hooghly River, but there was also a trading town called Hooghly. There is a Hooghly in the present day, which was a big trading town. And Siraj came down to Hooghly as the heir apparent of Ali Berdi Khan. And the British went up to Hooghly from Calcutta and feted Siraj, gave Siraj gifts. Can I read out to you a little bit from the book as to what kind of gifts they gave? Let me see if I can find it. Let me find it here. This is the British East India Company, and this is from company records, okay? British East India Company records, not Chakravarti and Company. In the accounts of presents to Siraj-ud-Daulah and his officers on their visit to Hooghly are entered 35 gold mohurs, rupees 677, worth rupees 677, a lot of money in those days. Ready money from rupees 1,500, wax candles of rupees, very clinically kept records in the company letters. After all, they were businessmen. This was a company, right? So they kept very good. Wax candles worth 1,100 rupees, clock worth 880 rupees, looking glasses of 2 pairs worth 550 rupees. Okay? These are 1750s rupees, not 2021 rupees. Okay? 2 marble slabs worth rupees 220. 1 pair of pistols, diamond ring worth nearly 1,500 rupees. For Ali Berdi's wife and the women of the court, 26 gold mohurs. The fakirs who came with the entourage received a lot of money. Then the Fauzdar got Hooghly, and in return, Siraj-ud-Daulah received a robe of honor and an elephant. And after that, Siraj-ud-Daulah sent them a note of thanks. And Ali Berdi Khan sent the British a note of thanks, saying, and here, and then this is 1752, right? And then they write to the company writes to Britain saying that they, at a small expense, they've got great favors. This is a business document that they've done. It's a business entity, right? Nothing emotional about it, right? Then Roger Drake, who's the governor of Port William, receives a note of thanks from Sirajuddaula. Okay, and this was he added to a parwana that Aliwardi Khan gave. He adds, Siraj is adding this. You are a great man, he's telling Roger Drake, who's the governor of Fort William, which is the base for the British East India Company at the time. You are a great man, and that greatness becomes you, and the head of all merchants, the standard of all merchants. It's in the flowery language of that time. But to claim that the British and Siraj were fighting all the time, and Siraj is the sole reason why the British is, let me not mince words, Homer. It is absolute, utter bullshit. There's no other way to describe it. It is myth-making. It is bullshit. It is absolute hogwash. It is rubbish. And these are the kinder adjectives that I this kind of history writing with. And when I read these histories, and I read the kind of histories that the British have written, and the kind of histories we've been taught in school and college, my blood begins to boil. Sorry, I'm getting a bit upset. Now, I'll give you another example about about how close fought a thing was, and then we can move on to another part of the conversation. I told you earlier about how close, nervous Robert Clive was before the Battle of Plassey, and valorized for everything. Okay, so he entered into agreement which also included the Jagat Seth, Mir Jafar and other people in the Bengal court. That's fine. But note that this is something that this is again from company records. This is not mythical records. These are right from company records that he writes. This is Robert Clive to Mir Jafar on the basis of an alliance with whom he has assured the company directors in Calcutta and the London that it is worth taking this step, which is to go up from Calcutta to Hooghly to Chhattisgarh, defeating the French, and then to move slowly towards Murshidabad. And in the met at the field of Plassey, which is why all the Battle of Plassey, or Plassey in Hindi. This is Clive writing to Mir Jafar. Okay, couple of days before the battle. I'm determined to risk anything on your account, though you will not exert yourself. I shall be on the other side of the river this evening. If you will join me at Plassey, I will march halfway to meet you, and the whole Nawab's army will know that I fight for you. Give me leave to call your mind how much your own glory and safety depends upon it. Be assured, if you do this, you will be the Subha of these provinces. Cannot go even this length to assist us. I call God to witness that the fault is not mine, and I must desire your counsel, including a peace with the Nawab. And here, what Clive is talking about is Sirajuddaula. So he's telling Mir Jafar that if you don't come with me, I'm going to make peace with the Nawab, and nobody will be the wiser. This is 2 days before the Battle of Plassey. All right? And what has passed between us will never be known. What can I say more that I'm as desirous of your success's welfare as my own? This is a business deal taking place. A day later, and some people say the morning, there is a dispute about this, that it was sent the night of 22nd of June. Some say it was sent 23rd of June, early in the morning. The battle began at 8 a.m. This was sent hours before that. Clive is again writing to Jafar, his biggest co-conspirator against Sirajuddaula. And this is referred to by company sources, and this is referred to by Robert Orme, who's a military historian engaged by the company and a personal friend of Robert Clive's, by the way. And Clive again writes to Mir Jafar, whatever could be done by me, I have done. I can do no more. If you come to Daudpur, which is a village sort of northeast of Plassey, I will march from Plassey to meet you. But if you won't comply even with this, pardon me, I shall make it up with the Nawab. All right? Now, You tell me what is truth and what is reality, what is myth, what is fact, what is fiction, and why would the British East India Company faithfully maintain such records, and why wouldn't historians or writers or analysts or observers or nationalist historians of every color and ethnicity and religion neglect to look at records such as this, which are made available to a simple person like me? I'm not an Oxbridge historian. I'm a lover of history who has a discipline in journalism and research up for history, who also has, I'm a storyteller and I'm deeply rooted in my work. This book is history. It is not fiction. Every bit of it is research. And what sources am I referring to? Recorded sources, not made up sources. Documented, clinically documented sources. So, you have to reach out. You have to reach out in the right way. And these are available to me like they're available to people who have far more resources than I do. Way, way more resources than I do. In fact, why aren't other people doing it? That's a question I would like to ask history telling. And I'm so happy, Omar, that in the subcontinent, in India, in Bangladesh, elsewhere, I think we moved beyond this need, this absolutely crying for making up history. And there are many, many fine people, women, men, boys, girls, students, practitioners, teachers, researchers, writers, historians, political scientists, ethnographers, anthropologists, you name it, who are interrogating history in many, many ways and are claiming their own histories by asking hard questions, simple questions, and trying to get at what really happened. That is so good for history.
Well, a question while you were talking about the right narrative is how does anyone who is not an avid reader of history or a student of the discipline, judge between what is right and what is wrong, or rather, what is true or false, what is real or fabricated? How does one make a conscious decision of selectively reading objectively true history?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I would separate it, and here I would put my research hat on and my journalism hat on and my historian hat on as well, and combine all the things and say that, what I'm offering you in our conversation is not opinion. It's an observation based on what I've seen and heard and read. Now, a reader, and that is also one of the key issues about, you can tell people are not, they're not stupid. I mean, people are not stupid. People often end up believing in what they want to believe in because it suits them. But I can assure you that there are people who will read a certain history and gauge for themselves as being opinion. For instance, there are historians, there are many Bengali historians and writers and great intellectuals and great emancipators of Bengal, for instance, who whitewashed this whole Battle of Plassey thing and made it off against, thank God that the British have come and they have got rid of the Yavanas, the Muslim rulers who dominated us for so many centuries, from the 12th and 13th centuries onwards, destroyed Bengal culture and whatever, without realizing that the Hindu culture, without realizing, ironically, you had the Hindu kings in Bengal who also destroyed the Buddhist kings who were of Bengal as well. So you have these grand denunciations that were made. These big bad Yavanas and the Islamic, these Nawabs, and they're terrible people, and thank heavens the British are with us. And then, people like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, for instance, one of the greatest intellectuals of Renaissance Bengal, one of the greatest emancipators of Bengal, the person who fought for abolition fee, who fought for widow remarriage. I mean, imagine the things he did for civilization, if you will. He parroted the same theory about Swaraj because he was part of the Bengal Renaissance, which came out of the funding and the facilitation of the East India Company. Let's not forget that the Bengal Renaissance is a direct benefit route of the Bengalis are probably going to take out a contract on me. But I said it in my book, The Bengalis, in any case. But, so, which is also very deeply rooted in history. So we have to interrogate these and we have to look deeper in these very aspects. So we have to question why Bangladesh sees it so importantly. It's important to whitewash or greenwash Siraj into this valorous individual who became a martyr. And in Bangladesh, he's portrayed as a last Bengali Nawab, which is all wrong. In fact, the Bangladesh government actually funded a project called Nawab Sirajuddaula, where Siraj is portrayed in this black gown, in this black turban, with the 5-star of Islam on the turban. And and you see the movie, it's available on YouTube. You can see it for yourself, or your viewers or readers or listeners can. I urge you to do that. Just go to YouTube and say Nawab Sirajuddaula, Bangladesh, and you will get that movie. And the opening sequences are of Siraj, holding in a very Bollywood fashion, holding the whip that this bad company man is using to whip this poor Bengali chap. And of course, the company man is played by a Bangladeshi actor, and he speaks in this ridiculous English saying "chup lao" and "hum tumko dekhega, maar denga," that kind of stuff. And then Sirajuddaula grabs the whip and he turns the whip on this big bad company guy, rescues the peasants and the farmers who have been tortured, and gallops across the paddy fields of Bengal. And for heaven's sake, Siraj never did that. It's just a mythical reputation for the need of a historiography that Bangladesh needed at that particular point to rewrite its own history, because Bangladesh had an issue with subcontinental history, because for them, history didn't begin in 1947 in some ways that began with the nationalists of India and Pakistan. For Bangladesh, the history began in 1971 when they formally broke away from West Pakistan, from Pakistan. So people write histories, they project histories, they project events and people, sometimes with ulterior motives. That becomes a very dangerous thing, you see. And that is a big, big problem, and we have to continually interrogate these aspects. In fact, that movie is part of my book. It is Nawab Sirajuddaula. I urge you and your listeners, viewers, and readers to watch it for themselves. What can I say?
So, when you were talking about the interconnectedness of history, I recalled how nothing occurs in a vacuum, and everything in history is relative to something or the other. So, tell us a bit about how the global events are shaping the drama that's unfolding in Bengal. For example, the British and French rivalry and the 7 Years' War and so on.
Well, it's very simple because, or not that simple, but it's simple when you break it down into. If you see Plassey or if you see any battle or the subsequent development in India or this continent as a geopolitical, geo-economic exercise, which is married to the exercise of enterprise. Like one of the other myths that are presented, and I'm deliberately mentioning this here, is that British historians will often say that big bad company. The government had nothing to do with it. It was a company enterprise which went ahead and raped and loot and drained the wealth of India. We had nothing to do with it. We did all we could for India. It's absolute bunkum because the British East India Company loaned money to the British government. The British government stood in as guarantor for the company all over the world. When Rai, who was an employee of the East India Company and commander of the land forces, came up from Madras to Calcutta, he traveled on ships, which were company ships and ships of His Majesty's Navy. And Admiral Charles Watson, who led that fleet into Calcutta, was an officer, an admiral of His Majesty's government. Before they left They actually even concluded a treaty between themselves and agreed of how to share the loot, spoils of war. So the it was a venture all along between company and crown, and it's true of the French East Indies Company and the French government, the Dutch East India Company, Dutch government, the Danish company, the Danish government. You see, so it's always gone hand in hand. Like today, business and politics go hand in hand. So when and here you have a situation where over and above business, you had the the European the Austrian War of Succession breaking out in the 1740s. Then you had the 10-year war, or the 7-year war breaking out in the 1750s, in which England and Britain and France were on opposing sides, like in the War of Austrian Succession, which actually led to a lot of the tension in southern India at that point of time between the British and the French. So let's not forget that the French fled into Madras, the seas of Madras, and took over and actually conquered Fort St. George as a direct offshoot, as a direct corollary, as an extension of the European War of Succession. And then the treaty making that happened in Europe also led to Fort St. George being handed back to the British after a while. And then when the British in turn took over Pondicherry, which was a French company headquarters in India at that point of time, that also happened on account of a treaty that took place in Europe, in which Britain and France signed the treaty, and they were fighting in Canada at that point of time. Britain and France, they were fighting in North America. They were plundering each other's shipping that were coming in with slaves from Africa and sugar and other produce from the Caribbean. They were fighting each other in East Asia, and the Dutch were also part of that fight. The Dutch were fighting the British were fighting the Dutch, the French were trying to keep each other at bay, trying to get their edge in. The Portuguese were a done deal by then in any case. Their age of empire had almost vanished because of the ascendancy of the British, the French, and the Dutch. The Danish were pockets of enterprise elsewhere. So this was a reality. And Germany was also trying to slowly get into the act at that particular point of time, without terribly too much success. So this is the global reality over at that particular point of time. So a lot of the activity that happened in the Indian subcontinent and the Carnatic Wars, for instance, where Britain and France were on opposing sides, or more correctly, their company forces and their government forces, joint ventures, were on opposing sides with each other's against each other's companies and countries. The same thing played out in India, played out in Bengal, and played out in Plassey as well. In fact, Sirajuddaula reached out to Pondicherry, the French in Pondicherry, to try and help them. The British were reaching out to the Maratha, the Peshwa Baji Rao II, trying to get his help into trying to defeat Siraj, the old Bengal enemies. Siraj was trying to see if he could reach out to the Mughal wazirs in the Mughal court in order to keep the Marathas at bay, and trying to work with the French, trying to keep the British at bay. I mean, so everyone was trying to control each other's and protect each other's spheres of influence for political control and economic control, because trade was a very, very big thing at that point of time. And in the background, you had this European aspect playing out. You had this sort of global aspect playing out. I mean, it is absolutely geo-economic, like today. It was happening in the middle of the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century, middle of the 18th century, the end of the 18th century. It continues to this day. So we have to understand these dynamics.
Like most important events of history, you mentioned that even the story of Plassey has been through multiple retellings. And so my question is how has the narrative changed over the period of time, and how does your book challenge the status quo? How does one look back for the right and objective narrative?
Well, the thing is that there are works of history which are pure history. There are works of pure history which sometimes get described as popular history, which is a term which is usually a term given by academicians to such books, not by those who write them, I can assure you. For instance, I mean, we work, we are also students of history. We are practitioners of history. Maybe I don't have a PhD in history, but I can assure you that I put in a lot of rigor into my research and writing. But I'm being facetious here, only partly. But I think there are many people who are doing it. There is no. I think it's a personal thing that when you, as a student of history, as a reader of history, as a reader of politics, a reader of current affairs of the world at large, when something triggers you and you go back and say, hey, we haven't heard about that. Why haven't we heard about that? And why are these histories always so unidimensional? Whether it's a colonial history or whether it's a Mughal history or whether it's Indian nationalist history or a post-independence nationalist narrative or the so-called Marxist history. These are all kinds of aspects that which need to be considered. And then I guess it's up to one or the other researcher or writer or narrator to tell the story from his or her perspective, whether it's an absolutely academic publication, which is approached as a thesis or is approached as an academic publication and is presented as such, or it is something like the book that I've written, Plassey, which has been read by historians as well as lovers of history and students of history and people who are passionate about history, and different people have different opinions about it, but people haven't questioned my premise. They haven't questioned my sources. Nobody's questioned the accuracies of it, you see. So the point is, and I'll come up with other names, like, for instance, where there's this gentleman called Srinivas Reddy who's written a book on Krishna Deva Raya. And I think that's a fine effort, which is applauded by readers, students of history, lovers of history, as well as historians, because Mr. Reddy has gone and approached Krishna Deva Raya as a flesh and blood individual and has tried to peel away the layers, contextualize him in the time and place, so on and so forth. There are people who are writing histories about Mohandas Gandhi. There are people who are writing histories about Vallabhbhai Patel. There are people who are writing histories about the RSS. There are people who are writing history about the Bengal famine, or Indian participation in the world wars and how it has not been addressed enough. People are writing movements. The Muslims in modern India, decline, if you will, of the collective education, which many emancipators and leaders of the Islamic community in the Indian subcontinent probably sort of battled for, the same way that other people fought for the glory of Hinduism. You see? So there are people who are now trying to retell histories, who are trying to interrogate the past as has been handed down to us, and are trying to tell it in a more research fashion, in trying to tell it whether it's ancient history or medieval history or modern history, or histories of people, of places, of battles, not blind histories, but histories with open eyes, histories with open minds, with open hearts, not opinion history, but history. I think there's a lot of history taking place in the subcontinent, and that's, I think, it's an extremely good thing. And it's not surprising that in a time of history is being suppressed, when history writing, interrogative sense is being suppressed, when propaganda is replacing history, when propaganda is replacing everything, when that is today's reality, it is absolutely crucial. It is absolutely imperative that such interrogative histories are done, and I'm very happy that it's happening more and more. More power to all of us. I would say that.
So, before we conclude, what lessons do you think one can seek to learn from the Battle of Plassey? Like, how is an 18th century battle relevant to us in our times? And what should our listeners seek from your book, or the narrative in particular?
Because it's in the interconnectedness of things. I mean, I said it as a joke a little earlier, but I meant it as in utmost seriousness. We called ourselves an Anglophile nation. You know, our currency notes in India, and I'm saying our, and in India, and I mean Pakistan as well, where it may be Urdu in Pakistan, but there's English as well on that currency note. There is, in India, there's Nagari script, which says ek saw rupees, but it also says 100 rupees. In Bangladesh, it says aksho taka, but on the obverse it will say 100 taka. In Nepal, it will say the Nepali rupee, but they'll be in English. In Sri Lanka, a form of money. There is in Tamil, in Sinhala, and in English. So that alone should tell where we've come from. And aren't you curious as to why you are the way you are, why we are the way we are, why our histories are driven in a particular way? You have the agrarian protests in northern India as we speak, but what is the root cause of that? Things that happen in the Green Revolution, time of the Green Revolution, or is it? Or is it the time that when the British created land laws in the Punjab, and which affected the Punjabi farmer, or the farmer in the Doab, in then united Punjab, if you will, and Haryana, Punjab, not Punjab as the British said, but Punjab as it ought to be said. Panjab is, to my mind, the right way to spell it, even in English. Punjab. So when in the Punjab, you take it back, then where is the root of that? The Crown government taking over 1857. How did that happen? Buxar. How did that happen? Plassey. Don't you want to know? When people say, oh, Plassey, Sirajuddaula, Robert, don't you want to know that, when these people say Siraj was a martyr, aren't you interested in finding out who is this chap, Siraj? What was he? How did he come to be in this particular place? What was happening in that particular point of time? How are we the way we are? Why is India divided? Why is the subcontinent divided? How do we have our issues? How do we have our railways? How do we have our trade? How do we have our Anglophile natures? What were the French doing here? What were the Portuguese doing here? Shaista Karna. What was Shaista Khan all about? How the phrase comes, used for Shaista Karenge. In Bengal, that's what the root is, because he fought with the British. Don't you want to be curious as to your own histories, or are we so consumed with WhatsApp University? Are we so consumed with Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram forwards, and our sort of family WhatsApp groups with our uncles and aunties that we've completely forgotten we have completely ignored the need of where truth lies, or where history lies, where the roots of the histories lie? Aren't we interested at all? Don't we damn? Or are we going to be following blind history and get stuck more and more into this morass of history, into this mythical history that we are being fed day and night, literally 24/7, through digital enterprise, through television enterprise, through absolutely undependable and delineated sources, not research sources? Is that what we're going to be doing? Following a future based on a blinded past? Is that what we're going to be living on? I don't think so. I hope not, because if that is what we're doing, we're doomed.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Chakravarti, for this beautiful conversation. It was an absolute delight to have you on as our first guest on our podcast. I'm sure our listeners will enjoy your book as much as I did and learn from the many hidden plots and subplots of the book.
Thank you everyone for tuning in to today's episode. We really hope you enjoyed it. This brings us to the end of today's podcast. If you liked it, please consider subscribing to us on any platform you're listening to us from and share it with your family and friends. Your support means a lot for us. Don't forget to check out our website www.historyoftheworld.com indiacolonized.com, that's colonized with an S, where we have more such interesting articles, blogs, and write ups just for you. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or any other social media platform to stay tuned with us about latest updates about our episodes and write ups. So until next time, stay safe, stay curious.